At my steamboat. And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Dark Ozarks on Facebook.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone is having a good Wednesday.
Yes. And it is a good Wednesday. I have coffee in my Ritchie Mansion House, Newtonia, Missouri mug, which is quite hot. There we go.
Love that house.
I love that house too. This is one of my favorite coffee mugs. I have a nice collection of favorite coffee mugs, but this one's in like the top 10.
Have 100.
Yeah, you've seen my collection. There's a lot to choose from, and
I can't say a whole lot. Mine has quite a few too. So
yes, it's good. So we have a really fun episode. We've already gotten warmed up on YouTube. Quick shout out to, we do have the Dark Ozarks YouTube channel. Encourage folks to go over there, like, share, follow, subscribe, click the notification bell, all of the things that I can never remember to do. So you guys go do them. But right now we are live on Facebook with Dark Ozarks, dealing with and breaking down and contemplating black magic and hoodoo. Yes,
but before we get started, we need to mention someone. Oh, good. You have materials.
I do have materials.
You?
Yeah. I know that cover.
You know that cover. You read about that cover, but that's for another video.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, Always Buying Books with Bob and Elise in Joplin, Missouri.
Yes. Fantastic selection. One of the best you're going to find anywhere. And as you are fond of saying now, it is like a TARDIS.
It is much larger on the inside than it is on the out. You pull up on the outside and you're like, that's a really small building. And you go inside and the books don't stop. I had so much fun there in the time that we were there. Highly encourage folks to stop and visit during regular business hours, which of course Bob has posted on all over online at Always Buying Books, Facebook group Always Buying Books, Facebook page for the business. And you can order, I believe, online.
You can. They have a website, alwaysbuyingbooks.net, and strong presence on Facebook. Just look up Always Buying Books, as well as a group, friends who like Always Buying Books. And it's pretty frequent that they actually put inventory on there, and you can call them or purchase directly through the page and have it mailed to you if you're not local. Yes.
And something that, well, first of all, something that is incredibly impressive to me is just the curation quality that Bob and Elise accomplish. The quality of their collections is phenomenal. Additionally, and this is a very, very good reason to stop in and browse, is that their prices are really, really good on so many different selections. And let's put it this way. It's very dangerous for me to go into a bookstore because I always come out with books. That is just one of those, well, I know, one of those realities. And let's just say that Bob made the entire experience very wonderful. And I was not penniless when I left. And so it was a beautiful trade. I had some wonderful books, and it was really positive. So, and have already started several of those books. And of course, lots and lots of great selection, children's books,
history,
and mystery. A lot of what really got me was world and American history, and then really interesting. We shouldn't say this so loudly because I want first dibs, but really interesting and well curated collection of occult and paranormal books as well.
Yes. And the good thing is inventory keeps coming in, so you never know what's going to be there.
So much fun. And we should also note that in conjunction with Bob and Elise and Always Buying Books, we have an October event already on the calendar.
Yes, Dark Ozarks October Country, a day-long event that we are going to cover a multitude of subjects that fall into our purview of unexplained mysteries, dark history, the paranormal, etc. We'll be at the VFW Post 534 on Main Street in Joplin on October 15th. Tickets are available. The event is on the page, so look for it, get your tickets, and it's going to be a good time.
It's going to be a magnificent day. There's several things that I really love about the Dark Ozarks events. One of the top is getting to visit with people, and it is none of the events that we do, we draw very little line of separation between, for example, like quote unquote stage and audience. It is highly interactive, and you and I and I think the rest of our panel often get to learn so much from you all, the public who attend. And the thing that I think that we give back in exchange is a really safe, vibrant environment in which to share, because there's so many people who have experienced things that are outside of the usual. Sometimes that is an experience that somebody might find interesting. Sometimes it's an experience that people find really unsettling, and they really need an opportunity and a positive environment to share, where there is not a sense of ostracization. And that's so much of the dynamic for Dark Ozarks events.
It really is, and we're glad to be able to do that, and then share whatever information, insight that we may have. Plus, we just have a good time, and so
yes.
It's time to get together with people of like interests and curiosities. So, put it on your calendar and come on out.
Absolutely, it's going to be really, really good. Check out the Dark Ozarks event page for that. And now, witchcraft, black magic, and hoodoo, a very complex umbrella of with a lot of moving parts and a lot of complex topics underneath that.
Yes, more a spider web of topics than anything.
Which is, only appropriate, because I have plenty of those, because I haven't bothered to dust lately. It's housework is overrated, but buying books is not, and reading books is not. So one of our starting points that I think is important is, I would say, first of all, wrapping our heads around the reality that the term witchcraft has many different facets and disciplines, both modern and ancient, that really defy many of the categories that we expect, but in some cases really embrace the stereotypes or the expectations. And then going beyond that, I have a pet boo back in the house with his toenails on the hardwood floor. Don't I? You want to hop up here? Hang on. Come here. Oh,
Hey,
this is my familiar.
Yes.
And he is a sweetheart, aren't you, baby? So he also likes socks.
And shoes.
And shoes. So there's this I find this entire topic, we'll just classify this, the broad category of witchcraft, to be incredibly, incredibly interesting for a wide variety of reasons. The first one is because of the many misconceptions that surround witchcraft. And some of those misconceptions are, of course, very negative, and it's very easy to go down sort of the tradition. I would classify as postmodern traditionalist. Sounds like an oxymoron. Postmodern tradition of decrying you know, the quote unquote, you know, primitive early modern witch hunts, etc. And at the same time, we also see some really interesting misconceptions. It's very loud toenails. So some very interesting misconceptions. He was asleep for the first part of the video.
Was I just as long as he's not, you know, conjuring a spell there, we're okay.
I know. Very interesting misconceptions in terms of modern witchcraft, with the largely, and I may get something thrown at me here, you know, later, not by you, but just by, you know, aspects of the public, that that much of our perceptions of modern witchcraft are comparatively recent, like 1940s, 1950s, and later recreations, so to speak.
Recreations and then slash pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people envision in this topic is clouded by, you know, movies and TV. And at this point, the cliches have been repeated so often, people think they're true.
Yes, I do think that it is fair for individuals and families outside of what I would consider to be ancestral witch traditions to react to witchcraft with fear, oftentimes.
Yes, I mean, it's very much the same that you see with a lot of the paranormal topics, but I think there really is a dichotomy. If you come from a background and know your background and it was embraced in growing up, then it's viewed much more normally and just a part of life versus, you know, a taboo subject, you know.
And I think that there's, and of course we are going to get into hoodoo, which, spoiler alert, is, for me anyway, the best way to describe hoodoo is it is a toolkit.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. It's not, again, a lot of the conceptions are clouded by pop culture.
Yes, and then and because you know, I really like the description or the definition of toolkit, because one does not associate ethics with a toolkit. A toolkit simply exists,
right?
And then, you know, if you want to use it to build a house, or, you know, saw somebody's porch swing down, that's entirely up to you. And we don't
build a house or tear one down.
Yes, we don't associate anything intrinsically nefarious with the existence of a toolkit or a toolbox. And I think that's very important. The other aspect that I find really fascinating is just the discussion points of quote unquote black magic, which we will get into, in both from a European perspective, sort of a fusion American perspective, and then also from some Native American traditions with an emphasis on the Cherokee. And black magic, depending on how, you know, on which of those ancestral lores that you're talking about, have some really interesting connotations. And something that is at times frustrating is the attempt of contemporary or modern Americans to compartmentalize magic into, for example, black or white magic. And magic doesn't really work like that.
No. Now, and again, with the fear of things being thrown, the sort of the 20th century incarnations, particularly Wicca, will tell you, yes, it's white, it's black, it's, you know, blah, blah, blah. But that is a basically mid-20th century contrivance, or, you know, compromise that ended up being done for whatever reason, but traditionally it's not. If you want to label it, everything is gray.
Yes. Yes. And something that is particularly important in the what I would classify as the modern era, and modern era I'm classifying as Shakespeare and later.
Yeah.
In case anybody is wondering, I'm corresponding it with modern English and the resultant culture and empire that followed, is that increasingly throughout that era, which continues to this day, witchcraft was heavily utilized, and hoodoo is as well. I'm putting them all into the same classification right now, by highly marginalized and disenfranchised peoples, largely in an attempt to achieve justice from their vantage point.
That's true, but just to throw a little bit of a curveball into that, it was also very common for powerful people, and including monarchs, to consult witches or soothsayers for advice.
Yes.
And so while part and parcel, it was the disenfranchised, it was very much utilized by the powerful as well.
Which is a really interesting dynamic. And along with that, well, get over here. Along with that is, now the person that comes to mind, come here. The person that comes to mind is Queen Elizabeth I and John Dee.
Certainly.
Who comes to mind. I'm trying to think. Obviously, James I was probably not consulting with witches. Would be my guess.
Probably not after he was cursed by one, yeah.
Possibly before. Now, I'm trying to think. It would be really interesting if we could document some of those connections over a couple of hundred years. I think that would be really, really fascinating particularly in terms of English monarchy, because there was a really strong sort of yin and yang going on.
Yeah.
In terms of monarchy that would either ignore or embrace, more earthy traditions, and then those that would lean more toward a essentially we're heavily embracing Protestantism in its more Puritan styles. Yeah, I'm gonna grab a dog. Speaking of familiar,
give an indication, it was when you get to Charles and so forth, the more puritanical elements tended to leave England and go to Denmark, before they came to America. So
yes, exactly.
So this tussle between the two, it went on for quite a long time.
It did, and something that part of this is sort of sideways assumption on my part, and part of it is, I think, a very real aspect, is that with certainly on the local level, Catholicism was a lot more understanding or accepting of what we would now classify as pagan traditions on the ground than Protestantism ever was.
Yes, and well, Catholicism very early took the position of absorbing and accepting local beliefs and basically incorporating them.
Yes.
So that you brought the masses into the fold. And the Protestants rejected that, and not only rejected Catholicism, but traditional beliefs and was much more rigid.
Yes. And I find it interesting. I'm recalling a particular recollection that actually does date to Wales post-Reformation or post-Anglican Church, that was the basic idea was, we have our village witch, and as long as as long as nobody says anything, nobody's going to care.
Right.
In that sense. So nothing within this situation, you hush, nothing within this situation is monolithic. There's just a wide variety of realities that are competing with one another. And within that, at the same time, you do have these moments where it really gets to be a problem. For example, with the Scottish witch hunts in the 1500s.
Yeah.
And I think, we've all grown up with the Salem tradition, and kind of the understanding of what this says in the context of conspiracy, the context of paranoia, the context of the fear of the unknown. And these are all incredibly valid points. At the same time, for folks like, certainly I'll speak only for myself, but there is an understanding that witchcraft and magic is real. It's not always terribly common. Sometimes, however, it is more common than people might necessarily realize. And it is often being employed in unique ways, so that when there is a postmodernist take, I would say postmodernist being 1950 and later, that the witchcraft doesn't exist, and so individuals' fear of it is ridiculous. I disagree with that.
Very much so. And even if you don't want to debate sort of the empirical rationale of whether or not magical forces exist, you just have to look at the outcomes in situations of what happened in communities. Salem is one of them. In fact, this Salem village was out of step with the larger colony around it at that point. And people in Boston and so forth didn't believe this was happening at first. They thought it was just a tall tale someone was telling, what they're doing, what so it took a while for the authorities to say, we need to settle down here.
Yes, it is. Now, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the beginning of the witch panic in Salem actually started with a West Indian woman who was practicing.
She was. And to be perfectly honest, how it started was, she would practice, and it wasn't a matter that she was, quote, practicing to, get even with a neighbor or this or that, but incorporating, what in the last 150 years in the Ozarks would be, granny women traditions. Basically those kind of things. And actually what got things started was basically a scrying technique where you would, I believe it was eggs, break eggs into water or something, and
Marley's ghost is rattling his chains. Hang on, I apologize.
Yes, good sound effects. And a couple of the girls in the household they would use this, and it was common. It was a common thing, kind of like Bloody Mary, saying Bloody Mary in the mirror, things like that, of the time, to do this. And what you would see in the egg and the water was to tell the girls the name of the man they would marry.
Yes.
And I forget
incredibly
exactly
common divination.
one of them, with one of the times they did it, but something happened that it scared them. And so then it turned into Tisha must have been trying to curse them, etc. And from there it sprang.
And I think while it is a really important lesson on essentially fear, paranoia, and panic, it is also, the origin point of the divination, which is not to what's the right word for it? Not to explain the overreaction,
right,
that took place, is a really interesting peek into this window of some of these, which you could classify as witch traditions. It is also, I think, a really important aspect that to such a large degree, many of these, like this being one of them, that this entire episode of American history, which for the record was pretty minimal, not minimal to the individuals who were executed, but minimal in the larger scheme of things, is, it is a peek into this window of divination practices that I think is really fascinating.
Exactly. And it just morphed, and then they got scared that they'd be in trouble, mainly because their father was a minister and very, very conservative, puritanical, and so they were afraid that found out what they were doing, that so it was easier to say that they had been bewitched by the old lady down the road. So, and then it just worked. And it also, in fairness, it came down to a division in the community between two families and naming each other. So you had a bit of, Hatfield McCoy that got that feud kind of thing, kind of got fused into it. And so who was believed and not really came down to quote party lines who you were associated with. And so you had all those factors.
Yes. And in some cases, some really, obviously some very irrational responses. I think it is important to note that, to my knowledge, no witches in North America were burned.
That's correct. At least in Salem, I'm not sure just completely. I don't think there were, but certainly at Salem there were not. They were hanged, and Giles Corey was pressed to death. But no burnings. No.
And in terms of the scope of, we often see persecution of witchcraft through the lens of Salem. I do think that the early Puritans' long-lasting curse was that Salem is forever and indelibly linked to witchcraft, not Puritanism.
That's very true. Oh, the ironies.
No, not what that they had in mind, but again, I'm speaking in terms of broader contextualization. This is not to diminish the deaths of a handful of individuals who were executed in Salem for essentially no good reason whatsoever.
Right.
It is, I think, important to contextualize. I feel that one of the pop culture elements is that Salem, could have been at the center of these proverbial, non-literal witch burnings, they're mythical witch burnings, etc. This was happening very, very late. Essentially, as you already noted, individuals in Boston were largely going, "What on earth is going on down there?
Right.
What's wrong with these people?" And that many contemporaries, even of the region, were responding much like we would be responding. They were, from a very modern sensibility.
Yes, very, very much so. And um, it's almost a study in isolationism and group psychology, that makes me almost think a little bit of, like Stockholm syndrome,
Mhm.
that you have something very strange happen in a unique set of facts.
Yes, and from a truly historical perspective, you have a situation where the severe witch persecution in Europe had been taking place for a long period of time at a much higher level of severity, and
Oh yeah.
that much of that panic had largely died out, and had been quote unquote exorcised, from the situation, from public discourse or public dialogue, and an understanding that, and hopefully an understanding that, wow, maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
By the same token, they estimate about 150,000 people were burned at the stake in Europe.
Yes.
So,
And so all of this to be said, the Salem situation, as juicy, I suppose, from a retcon position, and as tragic as it was a drop in the bucket compared to what had happened, say, 100 years earlier in continental Europe.
definitely. And sad to say, not as brutal.
Yeah.
And so we in America never really went through the same terror, widespread terror that Europe did, that really kind of drove practitioners underground.
Yeah.
Probably more so than here. And then, of course, some of them did come to America
Yes.
over time. And so the practice and the traditions never completely went away, but they got called different things, and a little smoke and mirrors. So, we don't call it witchcraft. We
Right.
call it healing or herbalism or this or that.
Mhm.
And so that we don't draw that attention.
Right. And that is something, it's a dynamic that I think is very unique in the modern world, that the new world, quote unquote, North America, opened up to settlement by Europeans really during that time when there was widespread persecution of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And a dynamic that I find of particular interest is that there's a number of Protestant sects fled continental Europe
Mm-hmm.
to and came to North America to escape religious persecution. What was interesting as a point of comparison was that the Protestant sects often ended up founding dominant denominations and writing their own histories and publishing their own books.
Mm-hmm.
And the occult practices, to such a very large degree, stayed hidden out and out of sight, even in North America.
Yes, very much so. Very much an oral tradition.
Yes. And I think that there is an element of I think it is fair to say that witch traditions, I'm going to use that term very broadly, but the sense of essentially metaphysical understanding that is passed from person to person ancestrally is something that, while the structural traditions might have been lost over the several generations, and I'm speaking essentially from, say, like 1700 to 1900, in many cases the family lines and the awareness, the metaphysical awareness of people within those family lines has often remained intact, or in some cases where it might have skipped a generation, or it might have skipped several, for example, several siblings, but then manifested itself in a single sibling and then continue that tradition on. It's very consistent to have families who have what I would classify as metaphysical awareness, but it would be classified as, as essentially being of a witch family.
Yes. And yes, definitely.
and that's that. And there's plenty of lineages to that are tied to various regions, various European regions, but it does seem to be heavily that there's a lot of strong witch family traditions associated with the Celts, and many of those are very documented. So to me, it's very encouraging, because and I think funny in the sense that just because people could try to stamp it out doesn't mean that you even can. This is, an awareness that follows down through lineages, as a natural course of things.
It does. Basically, it becomes a situation where like-minded people ultimately just recognize like-minded people. But it's like saying that we're going to stamp out any physical trait, or characteristic.
It is.
And I think that's the thing that in our postmodern sense that's dominated by pop culture and the reinvention of quote witchcraft in the 20th century, such as Wicca and I think you mentioned Gardner and Crowley earlier, we forget that it's not just a matter of a received knowledge in a book. It's much broader than that.
It is, and I think the best definition I've come up with so far is just what sort of fell out of my mouth a moment ago, which is metaphysical awareness that runs in families.
Yes, I think that's entirely fair. And then just whatever practices are remembered and passed down, and sometimes not even the people receiving them under knowing why or what the purpose is. That part can be lost over time, but if you look at enough instances over time, sometimes you can figure out a little bit.
Yes, and some of what I'm about to say is a bit of conjecture, but I think that the contextual aspects of history bear this out, and certainly in a number of individuals' familial histories and experiences bear this out. That understanding of metaphysical awareness is something that we have lost, as society and culture. We have largely lost since, say, approximately the 1840s. There, give or take, And really, in some senses earlier, the industrialization and metaphysical awareness often don't really mix that well.
Sometimes not.
And so I think that it is fair to conjecture that in preceding community or cultural frameworks, that there were sophisticated understandings of the metaphysical, of the supernatural, and understandings of those, those of a witch tradition having growing up with innate understanding of their role within that larger space.
Mm-hmm.
With a post, essentially the postmodernist, or the moving into the contemporary world and a post-industrialized world, that much of those contextualizations, much of those traditions are lost, and yet the awareness remains. And so it's not unreasonable for an individual to grow up with, say, for example, just putting it very plainly, being able to know things before they happen, being able to, to see elements of the spiritual realm, being able to see all of these things, but not have a contextualization to understand that, oh, that's normal, here's what you do. And it can be very isolating to those individuals because they're essentially orphaned from their tradition.
Very, very much so. And I think in contrast, though, ironically, we want to look at the East African traditions that came over and then into the Caribbean and then onto the continent. There was much more of a continuity. It was not repressed within the community, within largely the slave community. It was not repressed, and that information and knowledge, the context was handed down. And the funny thing is, even today, we accept that. We accept that that is received knowledge, and that's what's happening with practitioners. Whereas for the European tradition, it, as you said, it has been orphaned.
And I would largely conjecture that one of the strong appeals of Wicca is an attempt to reconnect with that contextualization, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And there are within, once you've stepped into this metaphysical realm and its associated toolbox, there are elements that run strongly counter to modernistic or industrialized modern thought.
Exactly. No, I agree.
And I would go so far, and I'm gonna see who I can make mad when I say this, but I would go so far as to say that there's been an excessive conflation at this point between American modernism and American Christianity, that there's oftentimes people have a very difficult time separating those two, and that there's just an expectation of this is the way it is. So to give a specific example, and I'm come from a very strong, longstanding Christian background and tradition as well, and I participate. But the idea that if you're a Christian, then you can't believe in ghosts. I'll say that, throw that out there, which is not
witchcraft.
Yes. And that is, first of all, it can be, quite reasonably argued that Scripture disagrees, but there's what I would classify as often a troubling commercialism and modernism that is associated, and secularism even to go so far as to say a secularism that is associated with modern Christianity that the traditions of Scripture do not actually line up with. But when we're presented with things that we think of as witchcraft or things that we think of as the supernatural and the paranormal, some of those knee-jerk responses that are like, really 20th century, largely 20th century secular inventions, kick in and are conflated with the Christian faith. And I would challenge people, if you are Christian and you have a problem with the supernatural, to go look at Scripture, because Scripture is filled with the supernatural and not just God.
Well, yeah, but by definition, it is.
Yes.
And so I've always found it ironic that those that are ostensibly so concerned and interested in spirituality only want a small sliver of the spirituality realm.
Yes. And, along these lines, this is a conversation, whether it's being had through words or through actions, is something that folks in the modern day United States, North America, United States, had been struggling with for a really long time, has largely translated itself through, to help create or shape or direct the conversations around hoodoo and voodoo.
Mm-hmm. True.
Which I think is fascinating. And, you mentioned the African traditions, particularly the West African traditions. There, on one hand, there was that devastating cultural break where slaves were taken from their homes, taken from their ancestral lands, and yet there is less of the long-term breakdown that you see from generation after generation, sort of forgetting their past as they're modernized into contemporary culture, but a situation where the slaves who survived the voyage across the Atlantic, particularly in Haiti, but not exclusively Haiti. We're also talking about South Carolina, North Carolina, the low country. We're talking about Georgia. We're talking about the Gulf Coast, as well as Santo Domingo and Cuba and the Bahamas, the Caribbean, etc. That there really was only one generation separation, and many of those traditions were continued and carried on, albeit away from the slave owner's eye in most cases.
Yes, very much so. And in some ways, in subterfuge used so that the white population didn't realize that's what was going on. Which, to be perfectly honest, in some ways they were much more successful in preserving some of the identity than some of our European.
Very much so. Very, very much so. And of course, voodoo is the crowning result, I think the crowning successful result of this, which there is a conflation with Roman Catholicism. That said, it was largely a trapping to associate the traditional Iwa, the traditional Loa of Western African religion with quote unquote saints that carried some of the same characteristics, so that they could not be persecuted, and that they could be going to church, quote unquote, but still retain their traditional practices, which in all fairness I think is kind of really awesome.
It really isn't, and to be honest, is exactly what the Catholic Church did to pagan societies that they basically encroached on.
It did. So in terms of hoodoo, and of course hoodoo is again more largely, not exclusively, but largely more of the tool set um, associated with voodoo, but not exclusively. So it gets a little mixed up. There are European associations or influences, as well as Native American or American Indian influences in hoodoo. So it could be argued to a degree that hoodoo is a uniquely American practice in terms of its origin. Obviously, it can be practiced anywhere.
Right.
From
I think that is fairly safe to say. And it was taken on by Black population a lot, but white practitioners as well.
Yes.
And it's especially early on when you're looking at, say, pre-1900, particularly when you were talking about sort of spiritual warfare and things that in pop culture we associate with this, cursing someone and those kind of things. Typically, that only happened between hoodoo practitioners. They weren't doing this to the general population. It was a way of them battling and controlling an area. Think of it as a duel almost.
Yes. Now, in terms of, not exclusively in terms of the Ozarks, but generally speaking, the Ozarks, what do you see in terms of your research of hoodoo practices? What does hoodoo practices look like?
Hoodoo practices usually involve plants, herbs. Sometimes it kind of evolved into more uniquely American practices that were an amalgamation of things like witch spikes and witch trees, things like that for protection, catch signs, things like that. A lot for protection, and then a lot to deal with affecting someone through the use of herbalism.
Yes. I think that's very, very fair. It is tradition that is particularly resonant in traditional blues music.
Yes.
And I think that's very beautiful and rather exciting, actually. It's also strongly associated with crossroads magic.
Yes, very much so. Well, the crossroads, and just different protective signs that tend to be used are very reminiscent of crossroads. Often square crosses in a circle, things like that, were often used as a protective signal, on a building or in a pathway, that kind of thing. And so very much reminiscent of crossroads itself.
Yes. And it's now we've been able to study conjure in terms of how it is interacted with, because there are points that conjure interacts with investigations.
Yes.
And I know we've talked about it before, but I think it really bears discussion a little bit here. Is Kendrick House appears that some of the activity, some of the paranormal activity associated with Kendrick House appears to be related to hoodoo conjure.
Yes, and again, the postmodern knee-jerk reaction is, oh my gosh, that's evil, that's bad.
Yes.
But conjuring wasn't always bad. In fact, more often than not, it was not a means of an attack. It was a means of protecting the people around you or at your home, that kind of thing. And that did seem to be what was going on there, is that slave woman was a conjurer and had conjured a tulpa that seems to be there to basically watching over particularly women and children, which made a lot of sense in the context of the war there, because there were a lot of times that the women and children were there alone.
Yes. And here's an aspect that I find particularly interesting, and I feel like that this speaks into the toolbox aspect of hoodoo, of a conjure, is that the conjure is there to do a thing, oftentimes to protect a loved one, to protect the defenseless in this particular case. And that is, in understanding its context, even the most callous of us could easily conclude, yes, that makes sense. That's a very ethical thing to do. Let's create a spiritual thought form, or a manifestation that is there to protect the innocent. Okay, makes sense. Let's tether it.
Danger.
Yes, which it's reasonably apparent that this took place during the Civil War.
Yes,
and that makes a lot of sense. It makes perfect sense contextually. The idea that the conjure would remain tethered to the house, in this case particularly, seems to be tethered to the staircase area, or the foyer and staircase. Like, okay, that makes sense. Fine. The idea that it's still there and it still functions, to me, is actually quite beautiful. But then if someone who's highly antagonistic barges into the space, it may manifest in a very negative way. And then that person could say, oh my gosh, that's a malevolent entity. It's a spirit. It's evil. Get back. And yet many of us, if we enter the space in a non-antagonistic way, may not even be aware of it. We won't trigger it. There will be no response. The fact that you could have happy, comfortable, loving families interacting around and within this space for generations and have no response whatsoever until the wrong person goes in.
Exactly. And even then, it's a matter of being antagonistic and interacting, it's pretty much, it very much is a situation where it's, brought upon yourself if there's consequences.
And I think that oh, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, another aspect of this is that conjurings had to be tended. There is basically offerings made, typically food, things that are white, viewed as pure, typically rice or eggs, things like that, or tobacco, or alcohol, usually rum, and it usually centered around a fetish bag or a fetish ball or bowl, where basically the tools for the conjuring were kept. And then once the conjurer is gone and no one's tending to it, it remains, but it doesn't ever act contrary to its purpose, but it can get distracted and mischievous like a small child, basically.
Or grumpy.
Huh?
Or grumpy.
Or grumpy, yeah. But yeah, like a toddler who needs a nap.
Yeah, which is, I think, again, understanding many of the working components of some of these situations helps to be a bit more understanding when our pop culture tells us to freak the hell out.
Exactly. And again, a lot of these situations we would probably view much differently. One, if we hadn't been orphaned from our traditions, and
Yeah.
two, if the cliches in pop culture weren't thrown at us all the time to the point
Yeah.
that most people believe that they're the truth.
Yes. I think it's I think that it is reasonably fair, and of course I'm going to mention something that I don't have personal practice experience in, um on the assuaging, or the offering, the placating
Mhm.
of a conjure, because I've studied it, haven't actually done it. But I think that it's fair to say that with the right operational technique and the right intent and space, it's a lot better of an idea to offer a conjure a shot of good rum than it is to try to sage it out and call it a demon.
Very much so. And and as far as maybe, as far as being in that situation and actually, doing the offerings, yes, I do have experience with that, and it does usually tend to go much better. And I've seen people take the other tactic, and it typically has not worked out as well for them.
No, and there's just a little bit of common sense. If you were tasked with guarding a place over the generations,
Mhm.
and one person comes in and tries to smoke you out and yell at you, and the other person offers you a shot of rum, which one's going to make you happier? I'm
Aside from the fact, well, and aside from the fact that that's what would have been done initially anyway, and would be familiar.
Yes, yes, and very appropriately so.
This may be, maybe this is, we're close to a good breaking point, because I know we're not anywhere done, and we're going to be talking about this next week as well.
We have a lot more material to cover. So yeah, let's I guess we'll wrap for tonight, but we will continue this discussion next week.
And we hope everyone has a good week, and we're looking forward to this. It's going to be a good conversation with a lot more information. And if you
Yes, it
guys
is.
have particular questions, let us know and we'll try to address them.
Absolutely. We look forward to that. We appreciate everybody. Lisa, thank you. Cameron, thank you. Appreciate you guys so much.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone, and have a good week.
Absolutely.
Maybe having a little technical difficulty. See what I can do.